Hello and welcome to yet another episode of LawWiser On Air. We have seen a lot of policy regulatory developments, and the latest one being Press Note 3 amendment that has happened. Let me very quickly explain what exactly it is. So the Press Note 3, which came in 2020, required government approval for any FDI from countries sharing land borders with India, aimed at preventing opportunistic or indirect takeovers. It also covered indirect investments via beneficial ownership, which created significant deal uncertainty at that time. But that has changed now. What exactly has changed? The 2026 relaxations introduces a threshold-based approach, which is about 10%, allowing non-controlling indirect stakes through the automatic route. Net, what has happened? That India has shifted from a blanket restriction to a more calibrated, control-focused regime that balances security with capital flow. I mean, there's a lot of political discussion that is happening around it related to the security aspect, but we will jump into the business aspect of it. Some of the points we would cover today would be, deal flow and investment activities that are going to happen, speed and execution, capital flows, supply chain and manufacturing, and compliance. Let me take the pleasure in introducing our guest to you. We have Mr. Rajiv Malik, who is legal leader, LG Electronics India, and we also have Mr. Shivinder Kundra, who is a managing partner, KBD Law. I'll start with Rajiv. My first question to you is that what is the reaction of the industry, particularly foreign investors? And how are they looking at it? Is it like with enthusiasm or with caution?
Yeah, Aman, thank you first of all for having me here. And the views are, of course, my personal, right?
Of
And
course.
yeah, and to be very frank, this PN3 note was the emergency measure at that time, right? So I would say you asking about the sentiments. So sentiments are positive, but there is a layer of caution also. So India is clearly a strong opportunity, especially with the China plus one shift. But investors are equally focused on predictability. So can we really predict what policy is going to happen? So if you look at the numbers also, China itself ranks around 23rd in total FDI in India. And over the last 2 decades, so the concern was never about the volume actually. It was more about the strategic sensitivity, I must say, during the COVID time. And if you see over the experience over the past few years of this note, there were certain delays in approvals, and investors are a little bit careful. So, in a short, I can say interest is strong, but approach is calibrated.
Absolutely well said, actually. That came at the time of COVID. And that actually leads to another question that, it has been spoken about that, as far as manufacturing particularly is concerned, the supply chain vulnerability always existed and it depended a lot on Chinese goods. I'll shift this question to Shivinder that what do you think this is? Is it like, India giving up to that vulnerability, or this is like a very pragmatic and next level approach that is required in today's world? When you're looking at your reliance in manufacturing, eventually you will have to kind of, have all the components with you.
So I would consider this to be a pragmatic calibration and not giving into vulnerability. If you look at the context, and Rajiv has already discussed briefly, and if you look at the context of Press Note 3 of 220, there was, of course, COVID, and there was a fear that there will be aggressive takeovers or predatory takeovers, particularly from China. I mean, let's not fool ourselves into believing that we feared that there would be other countries or land border countries which would take over some of our assets. But now there is a recognition that we all understand that the geopolitical situation has changed dramatically. There is a considerable thaw in India-China relationship. I'm no security expert, but eventually, if you look at press note 2 of 226, it doesn't actually dilute the position very much. What it does is it clarifies our position. And we also clarifies our position with regard to a recognition that we must have access to global capital, particularly in the context of the growing number of startups. We must have access, and some of this capital could have Chinese exposure. And given, as I said, the thaw in our relationship and an understanding that we need access to capital, going forward and allowing say a 9.9% stake, it's 10 or less than 10%, would mean that you're allowing passive capital to flow into the country without really giving up on some of the concerns which we had with regard to strategic control of entities in India.
Yeah, and I think this is also going to create more imports. Shivendra, what do you think? That is going to supplement the manufacturing here in India, and that's where we could actually get some significant boost in the manufacturing as well.
Yes, I would say, and particularly, the government has also identified certain sectors, and particularly, we have to look at some of the emerging sectors within India. Now with China Plus One, which was already mentioned, I think particularly in EVs, also, climate-related equipment, and electronic goods and components. I think that should see some change. I don't know how much of a spurt there will be, given that the change is only up to 10%. I think the thing to recognize is it's not that we'll suddenly see a lot of Chinese capital flow into the country. It's just that we'll have global access to capital which might have had or which has Chinese exposure. So I think is the essential focus point.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to come back to you on that part, which is also very important, which is going to be the beneficial ownership aspect of it. But let me just go back to Rajiv and ask you a question that with conglomerates, that have got Chinese links, does this change simplify internal approvals? How are you looking at, do you think this is going to, accelerate India becoming China Plus One that we've been talking about it for quite some time now?
It's a very interesting question, Aman. First of all, we need to understand what exactly we mean by China One destination, right? And how careful we should be very careful while interpreting actually. So China Plus One does not mean that we are replacing China. It means basically diversifying away from over dependence on the China. Right. So China One requires not the just absence of China, but the replication of the capabilities. So China is a very strong holder, and we cannot avoid China at all. So today, in fact, if you will see, uh, most of the global manufacturing ecosystems, whether the components, intermediate good technology, certain steel parts are there, chips are there, all these things are EVs are there, batteries are there, so all are actually linked to China, right? So if so, so it can be a paradox if we say so. Even if capital from China is restricted, still India depends on Chinese supply chains. Uh, so we have a continuous trade dependence on China. So if we want to truly benefit from this concept, then I think we should domestically, we should build the domestic capacity should be enhanced and built, and we should attract the diverse capital not only from China and other things. And then we also need to integrate with the global supply chain. So policy is there, which is and but it has to be a real accelerator. And coming to the first part of it, from the that whether you just mentioned that I think
The
China
China
linkage,
linkage.
this China linkage, right? So there I think the real challenge was not the restriction itself, but the uncertainty was the main point there. Uh, uh, so, so that was creating the, I think, the internal hesitations. So approvals were slow and sometimes very unpredictable. So that was making the non-clarity in all these aspects. So I think it's the simplification of the approval process is that's what we require in today's and we are expecting out of the policy.
So basically, you're
Yeah.
saying that the compliance uncertainty is definitely going to be reduced,
Right.
for all foreign
Up to certain,
companies with
up to
up to
yes,
certain extent.
up to certain extent. We cannot say fully.
All right, all right. In fact, now let's quickly come back to the deal flow part. Shivinder, do you think that this is going to create a material increase in the deal flow, considering that we have more investments coming in, even if there's a bit of a Chinese linkage over there, and the the smoother inflow of deals or approval of the deals are going to happen. So, I mean, it's about the deal flow and then the approvals and all of that, which is going to actually make them see the light of the day. Do you think there is going to be a significant increase over there?
I think in the immediate or near term, it's more about the velocity increasing. Rajiv said that some of the approvals were mired in delays. I think that will change. Some of the approvals that were getting delayed now with a 60-day window, I think that hurdle we will cross. Uh, in the longer run, you will see improved deal flows or increased deal flows.
Yeah. So the thing is that um, this 10% threshold and 60-day window that we are talking about.
Yeah.
Do you see that's not just dependent upon the 10% test only, but I think there are a lot of other judgment calls over there related to voting rights and board representation and all of that. Do you think we would be able to, how much we would be able to kind of stick to that 60-day window, and how much subjectivity you foresee coming in on this?
I think the 60-day window applies more effectively to proposals that are already pending. So, not to say that it will not apply to proposals that are being made, but I think with these proposals getting either cleared or rejected, a more defined structure would have come into place in terms of the approval norms. Uh, what was your earlier question? Was it in relation to the 10% threshold?
Right, right. So,
So,
so my question was, my question was that the beneficial ownership part is
yeah,
quite subjective. It's not just 10%, but what is the kind of voting rights, what kind of control, et cetera, that the investor has, and all of those things will be scrutinized,
correct,
and
correct.
that could actually not only cause the delay, but uncertainty, and there's a lot of judgment call that's going to happen over there. How, first of all, reaction to that, but at the same time, how can that be overcome? I mean, what is the kind of roles lawyers can play in that situation? I mean, do you think the structuring would be more creative now moving forward?
So first of all, I'll take you back a little bit. This whole concern about, are we giving into too much, etc. The fact is that the 10% threshold is only the first stage. It can be less than 10%, but if you exercise effective control, you could still be blocked. And that effective control can come, as you have said, in many ways. It can be special rights, voting rights, veto. It can come in the form of any governance. It can come in the form of voting arrangements and so on and so forth. So that approval is going to be very fact-based. And in that context, the government still retains a lot of discretion with itself in terms of granting approvals, because this is going to be fact-based. As a result of which, and you said, how do we structure? I think the simpler structures would first look at a passive investment, because the moment you start getting into these over-engineered structures, it could lead to problems, because it's very evident now that the clarification with regard to what beneficial ownership is in terms of PMLA, which may have been either deliberately not covered or unintentionally. I will not comment on that. But now with that clarification being there, I think the way forward is simplicity rather than complicating structures, because the intent is to let capital flow. And as we evolve in terms of the current press note, and you may see further clarifications, we will see how it goes in terms of structuring the deals to incorporate some of the aspirations and at least some part of the wish list of VCs in particular, which are so concentrated, even as minority stakeholders, on some of the other rights to give them leverage. So at this juncture, I would say keep it simple. The press note has just been issued. You may fall foul if we over-engineer.
Right. So we've spoken about the deal flow, the kind of fillip that it is going to give in terms of the investments that are going to come in. Let me just very quickly come to one of the last questions that I have, and we then wrap it up. And this question is for both of you. Where do you see the biggest litigation or regulatory disputes emerging as a result of the changes and some of the provisions that are put?
So one is, we've discussed some of it already, Aman. Minority protection versus control is one. And how are we layering the structures? We could have issues there. But I see not the one more thing that I would like some more clarity is with regard to convertible instruments. It seems that the press note is veering towards a view, or rather a position, not a view, but a position, that compulsory convertible instruments should be considered on a fully diluted basis at the time of entry. The question that will arise is, what happens if it is contingent? Are we going to consider it now, or when the deal goes, for approval or to the government? Are they going to take that into consideration? That is, I think that needs to be, weighed in. And I would also say with regard to downstream investments, so that's another area where you could have regulatory issues coming into play. What happens to downstream investments? Although I believe that looking at policy, looking at the framework, downstream investments would also be clearly covered. But these are the areas which I see as some of the regulatory challenges. I don't see so much litigation in terms of or litigation on account of the press note directly, that is. But there could be litigation on account of over-engineering or over-structuring. And that might happen. as to how do we, there will always be a position where you would try and balance uh, the requirements of the press note with the requirements of, venture capital funds.
So Aman, you were just mentioning previously, and Shaivendra was also mentioning about the structuring because of the 10% threshold. Yeah, so first, I would like to answer that in a short note. That as my take is there that global companies, serious global companies, don't structure investments just to stay below a number of threshold, right? Actually, they are, of course, the thresholds influence planning, right? But the structures may be designed more thoughtfully. Right. So put it simply, if we can say the companies, the focus of the companies generally remain the stay aligned and with the regulatory intent only. So that's my take on the threshold. And regarding the litigation, if you say, Shivendra also talked about the timelines and the interpretation also. So I think the litigation or maybe the disputes, certain disputes can arise, but basically around the interpretation and timelines only, not serious. And one more thing is there regarding the beneficial ownership or whether it's the indirect control or the approval processes. These are really inherently the gray areas. So that will remain as it is, I think, or maybe we hope that some clarification will come in near future.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just one closing question. Do you think that we are tending to become frictionless jurisdiction for global capital in this context?
So I think three things. First of all, clarity, consistency, and speed. Clear rules so investors know actually what is there for them, right? Consistency, of course, the policy should not be shifting. Only then the people are giving. You have seen the volatility in the market, why it is happening because of inconsistencies, right? And speed also, because I have already raised the point of timeline. So these things, three things, I think are more relevant. And another thought is also there. India doesn't lack actually the capital interest. It sometimes struggle with the conversation of intent into the execution part. There, I think India is still lacking. And if that gap is bridged, and then India can be a preferred destination for global capital. Perhaps a few years from now, we may look back at this phase from 2020 to 25 and in future as a reminder of how quickly an emergency measure can become actually a part of the system, right? It remained part of the system for the last 5 years, although it was an emergency system. And how slowly we sometimes recognize that what, in fact, the data was telling us all these things, but still we were on the same part. So, the real question is not that whether caution was justified, but whether we are ready to move ahead from the caution to clarity, or from the restriction to the calibrated confidence. At least we should show that thing. And I must also say that at the same time, if we look at the economic reality, private capital expenditure in India still faces constraints, right, with import dependence. So, specifically in critical areas, right? EV, the battery, and so many other, in fact, for electronics goods also, right? So, the objective should not be to put the restriction on that, but thoughtful integration. In fact, if I go back to the Chanakya also, the Earth Shastra always says that the country and the city will thrive only once we are having the capital inflows, right? So that's the, I think, uh, that is the aim should be there for our policymakers and the legal community also, that we should see that the people should not hesitate in investing in India. Yes.
And considering the latest geopolitical situation and the world order, I think
Right.
India is
Right.
definitely has a great advantage.
Yes.
So, yeah, Shivinder, over to you.
I think I would have said much of what Rajiv has already said. I completely agree. Clarity, consistency, and the ability for an investor to be able to predict the outcome of his venture. I think that is the key. So, yes, going forward, uh, There maybe, as we discussed, there may be further clarification, but this is a small step in a much needed environment for accessing capital.
Thank you so much, Yuvendra. Thank you so much, Rajiv. This is all on Press Note 3 podcast today. And we would look forward to having you again in our next podcast that's going to come up very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.